On BBC Radio 3 this week, the essay examines the relationship between art and alternative mental states. Is creativity possible without a degree of mental instability?
In madness, you plumb the depths of human experience and sometimes the heights as well.
4 working artists, all of whom have a history of mental illness, talk through their perceptions of creativity and the disturbed mind. Raising My Voice, the essay, beginning this Monday night at 11 o'clock on BBC Radio 3.
And that's exactly what you're listening to, BBC Radio 3. It's 12:15 now. Tom Service marks Radio 3's 40th birthday in Music Matters.
Stand by for switching. Get tuned to Radio 1 or 2, 5, 4, 3. Radio 2, Radio 1, go.
The voice of Radio 1.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the exciting new sound of Radio 1.
So what about Radio 3? They all started on the same day, radios 1, 2, 3 and 4, but the beginning of Radio 3 was hardly a Radio 1-like blaze of glory. Now, the 30th of September 1967 on Radio 3 had, right in the middle of the day, 5.5 hours of sport. Sailing on the radio, anyone? At least there was building a library in the morning, though, on Schumann's Dichterliebe.
It was my way out of music that I already knew. It's a way for free of finding yourself, in a way.
Radio 3 gives me what I need in life as a backup to the psychological stresses of life.
Some of the people who've been broadcasting for a long time on Radio 3, I couldn't do without. They're stalwarts whose voices you trust, and as soon as you hear their voices, you know you've reached a station you want to stay with for a while.
10, 15 years ago it used to sound a bit kind of old and crusty, but now it seems much more relevant to me, perhaps because I'm older as well, I don't know.
I think that it's one of the jewels of our culture. I think it is probably one of the most important music stations in the world.
BBC Radio 3, good morning. On Saturday the 28th of February, this is Laurie Macmillan in London. Now, the daily forecast from the London Weather Centre.
Good morning. Well, despite the cloudy...
Today we have a recital of songs by Mozart and Schubert. And we're delighted to have with us the soprano Lucia Pop and the pianist Geoffrey Pass.
Hello. It's a very full Youth Orchestras of the World studio this week.
Here on BBC Radio 3 FM, you do have the extra advantage of stereo cricket for the first time, which means that in a moment or two, Jonathan Agnew will be where the first violins were.
And now, music in our time. This week,
when I was a boy at school, we occasionally had concerts on a Saturday night.
Lots of times in Music Weekly we talk about the past and the present of music. Now we're going to look at the future.
A piece for amateurs by Hindley.
Radio 3 over the decades, and composers Harrison Birtwistle and Julian Anderson and radio critic Sue Gaisford on what the network means to them, as well as some of today's listeners. On this week's show, I'll be talking to the people who shaped the sound of the station over the last 4 decades. And with me throughout this condensed history of the ideas and identity of Radio 3 will be cultural anthropologist Georgina Bourne, somebody who understands the BBC arguably better than anyone else. Her most recent book, Uncertain Vision, is a study of the corporation today. The reorganization of radio into separate strands in 1967 meant the birth of radios 1, 2, 3 and 4. But Radio 3's spiritual origins really go back to just after the war in 1946 and the third programme. Broadcast every night after 6 o'clock, the third programme presented debate, drama and music, and was only properly subsumed into the fabric of Radio 3 in 1970, which all sounds a bit confusing, doesn't it? In the late 1960s, Radio 3 was really just a mix of the daytime music programme, which had been going since 1964, and the third. So, to help us through this administrative labyrinth, here's historian Lord Asa Briggs. Even if nothing really changed for what you heard on the airwaves in September 1967, this was still a significant moment for Radio 3.
It was more than a change of name. It was a change, if you like, of orientation within the BBC itself. It developed Radio 3 under specialised controllers who were able to speak for that particular side of broadcasting, which wasn't covered by radios 1, 2 and 4. And they were able to develop their own concepts of programming, and according to their personalities, they had a very strong influence on the development of taste in music.
Well, even during the early years of the third programme, there was criticism within the BBC about listening figures. Now, if part of what Radio 3's remit was to focus on classical music, was there also an expectation that its listenership would go up? I mean, was it under the same pressures that the third programme was under?
It was never under the same pressures that the third programme faced, because, in fact, the expectations which were there at its beginning were not as far-reaching as they were when the third programme was started. What it was facing up to increasingly was, of course, competition from television. Therefore, it had to establish itself as a purveyor of the highest quality music in the most advanced form that you could present it to listeners.
Was it perceived within the BBC as an elitist phenomenon, Radio 3?
No, I don't think it was. I think it was thought of as part of the spectrum of broadcasting, a very necessary part of the spectrum of broadcasting. It was not like the third programme in its inception, which was bitterly attacked in the press because it seemed to be a waste of money, and that why should the BBC be putting so much money into the provision of programmes for a very small minority. There was no doubt about it from the start of Radio 3 that it would be able to argue for resources on its own terms with encouragement from the centre against radios 1, 2 and 4.
Lord Asa Briggs. Well, with me on my cultural journey through the changing landscape of Radio 3 is Georgina Bourne. Georgina, Lord Asa Briggs suggests something there that really right from the beginning of Radio 3 in 1967 there's a sort of tension between the aspects of it which are a legacy of the third programme and the other part of it which is the music programme. I mean, what was Radio 3 really for in 1967?
Well, I think he put his finger on it when he talked about the fact that there wasn't the overwhelming expectation of the third programme, because what came about in 67 was this completely new conception of a kind of spectrum of networks, and each would have its role, each would carve out their own particular audience, and of course it was unthinkable that the BBC should not have a cultural and classical music station.
Why?
Because the legacy from Reith, which has been unbroken, by the way, reinvented, evolved, updated, but unbroken, is that the BBC is here, apart from anything else, to develop the public's tastes in culture, art, music, and ideas. And so Radio 3 became sort of the corner in which that was particularly the challenge.
But in a certain sense, then, from the start, Radio 3 represented a kind of, I don't know, a moral compass for the BBC or for BBC Radio.
I think it's slightly different. I think that may have been true in the earlier decades. And you remember that there was a wonderful debate before the Second World War on music programming with Adrian Boult involved and so on, when it was this kind of good-for-you model versus, my God, we have troops out there, we have war is imminent, and we need music to bring people together and to reassure them and to uplift them and to give them entertainment. And that was a wonderful moment which kind of polarized those positions. But no, I think the conception is slightly different. It isn't about good for you. It's about the fact that we do music as the BBC. And the belief was, and at that time there was nothing wrong with this belief in the immediate post-war period, that it's art music, classical music, contemporary classical music, which is where the action is. That's where new things are happening, new music. That was equated with classical music.
What about in 1967? Was that still the right attitude?
What we have is the classic sort of time lag of the BBC, because from the Second World War onwards we get the rise of a whole new range of popular musics, and so we get the rise of the pirate popular music stations and Radio 1 belatedly picking that up. So what it was the BBC kind of responding to these new currents, but at the time, and one could argue still, not quite realizing that then innovation, invention in music begins to move out and not just inhabit classical music.
Well, the next witness in our story of Radio 3 is Robert Ponsonby, somebody who was controller of music at the BBC from 1972 until 1985. Now, somewhat strange title this, because what it meant, being controller of music, was making programmes for Radio 3 especially, but also looking after the BBC ensembles and orchestras and classical music on TV. So what was Robert Ponsonby's relationship with the controller of the network, with the controller of Radio 3?
I was in a position whereby I and my producers offered to the controller of Radio 3 the programmes we wanted to make, or had made. And by and large, controller Radio 3 accepted them.
Oh, that was Stephen Hurst at the beginning, was it?
It was initially Stephen Hurst, later Ian McIntyre. The problem was that I think both of them, anybody would have felt, that they didn't really have control over what was going on over there. And this other guy called Controller Music. One of the consequences of that was that there were endless squabbles, and the difficulty arose quite often because neither Stephen nor Ian was essentially a music person. So there were troubles all along the line.
What were the sort of things that were flashpoints between your division, the music division, and Radio 3? What were the roots of some of the complications?
I think there was a feeling that music division was full of experts, musicologists, who were interested only in broadcasting to other musicologists. And, of course, I have to say that my predecessor, William Glock, invited into the BBC people who he met in the street on a Monday and said, "Oh, come in next Monday, you know, Derek Cook, Basil Lamb, Robert Simpson, Hans Keller."
The musicologists and composers.
All musicologists, and some of them composers. And, of course, they were very scholarly and gifted musicians, and most of them wrote books in their spare time. And this was thought of by, dare I say, the somewhat Philistine senior management as an undesirable thing. What we want is chaps who are going to buckle down 12 hours a day and make programmes for the general public. We don't want these arty-farty musicologists.
What about the audience then? Because, I mean, even from the beginnings of the third programme, the question of Radio 3's audience becomes more and more of an issue. How was that debate framed? How was it thought of within the BBC when you were controller of music?
Well, I do not remember bothering too much about the listening figures. As long as we made very good programmes, and as long as the presentation was very persuasive and interesting, and I'm critical of today's presentation, very critical actually, then if one hit it off between scholarship and easy access, but never fudging the issue, I think it's terribly easy to condescend to the listener and to explain things that he doesn't need explaining. And I hope we got it right.
Robert Ponsonby, who was controller of music at the BBC from 1972 until 1985. Georgina Bourne is still with me. Georgina, it seems pretty extraordinary to imagine that even as recently as 1985, you could have a controller of one of the BBC departments saying, "Actually, I'm not too bothered about who's listening or even how many are listening."
In a way, yes. I mean, I have dual feelings on this. On the one hand, it seems to me, yes, anyone working in media should be interested in their audience and indeed troubled by, facts about the audience that perhaps contradict their assumptions about taste or whatever it is. But, of course, they should not be led by that, because culture doesn't come like that. It isn't produced by audiences. It's produced by interesting, brilliant and creative minds who do new things that audiences can't imagine. So I think they should not be obsessed, but should be interested. And actually, it refreshes me to hear that until 85 it was fine, and Radio 3, that was great.
There's another culture shift from where we are now in the BBC and where we are now generally thinking about, because we do want to think about who our audience is today. I mean, the BBC is often vexed by that process, as, all major broadcasters are. But also organisationally, the BBC has changed a lot internally since 1985. I mean, you're better placed than anyone to give us an insight into that.
Yes, I mean, it's very interesting, this whole question of should the controller of Radio 3 be a musician? And he gave us a wonderful kind of rhetorical account of, how weird it was that it was ever imagined that it should not be a musician. But actually, then he talked about people like Hans Keller, I mean, the fact is that if you have overly specialist controllers, they can become very narrow in their concerns. And in fact, it seems to me that there's a much more difficult task, which is the mixed person, represented rather well in recent decades, who can both stand back from current intellectual opinion and isn't completely wedded to that and isn't in the middle of those battles. Because the role of the controller Radio 3 is to be, frankly, a cultural commissar. They are in the vanguard of deciding what gets on the mass waves, what do the hundreds of thousands of people listening hear. This is not the role for a specialist musicologist.
One aspect of what any controller has to decide about is, as you were just saying, Georgina, about new music and about also performing styles. But we're going to hear now about the impact that Radio 3 had on specific performers and composers. Julian Anderson and Peter Maxwell Davies, two composers whose careers were partly sponsored by Radio 3 and for whom Radio 3 had a big effect as listeners. But first, from soprano Emma Kirkby, really a star of the early music world in the 1970s, who's indebted to the way that Radio 3 promoted this new way of thinking about old music throughout the 70s and 80s.
I think from the 70s onwards, which is when I was aware of what was going on in England, particularly with historical instruments and so on, the BBC was absolutely vital. They were incredibly helpful. They were very interested to give people a chance to experiment. Radio 3 was concerned to hear the music but also to talk about it and to get the musicologists involved. It was a very, very good atmosphere for people to start experimenting, and we got a lot of support from the BBC. I think it was the most important patron we had, definitely, and without it we might not have had the chance to practice, actually, to get the idea of what we were doing. People heard the result and they noticed what historical instruments can do, both for repertoire nobody knew and also for the repertoire we thought we knew, Handel and Bach and indeed Mozart, Vivaldi, all those big names. The radio was absolutely vital, yes, because everyone listened to it.
Very early days, before the appearance of William Glock, it was almost impossible to get your music onto radio, the program as it then was. And I do remember that Alexander Gurr and we actually did get something on, but it had to go not through the music department, but through another department, which I think was to do with documentaries. Because it was a very, very conservative institution. It was much easier after the advent of William Glock I didn't have to do anything about it. They just appeared in the programs and my pieces were played, and occasionally an orchestral piece was done, so I was much, much happier. I do feel rather sorry for composers that Glock rather disapproved of, who'd had a good time before the appearance of Glock and then rather disappeared. Some very, very good composers. William Alwyn, the work of people like Cyril Scott, those people that Elizabeth Lutyens used to call the English Cowpat School. Very good composers, I think. When they're no longer a threat to you, you can listen to them for what they are.
I think the BBC remains the biggest commissioner of new music, not only in Britain, but possibly anywhere. And that is terribly important for composers to discover their audience. If you're given the chance, as I've been given twice, very luckily, to write for the Proms, for example, you're thrown into a very public arena with an audience that may or may not want to hear a contemporary composition, and it is very exciting. And it gives your music a chance to get out there in the world. Also, it's important that a diverse range of composers are commissioned, and I believe that that has been so and will continue to be so, and I think that's very vital. It shouldn't just be this or that type, and I don't think it is.
What about the place of Radio 3 more generally? Do you have a sense of how much this matters in general terms? In other words, the things that Radio 3 is trying to do for culture, where it is and what it means today, and if that's changed?
I think it's bound to have changed because, for example, the internet didn't exist until, 10 years ago or something. So suddenly there's a whole lot more sound and information available. Now, the curious thing is, as a teacher of composition, what I found is that it does not mean that the people I'm getting to teach know more. In fact, I don't think they do. So that it seems to me the function of radio more than ever is to help. Why not? Let's be a bit patrician or Reithian about this. Guide people towards different areas of music. I think that's a very helpful thing. It doesn't have to be an educative, didactic kind of way of doing it, but it can be exploratory and innovative, and I think that's what it should continue to be.
Julian Anderson and Peter Maxwell Davies, and before them, soprano Emma Kirkby. Well, Georgina Bourne, there is a sense in which, if you're thinking about 40 years of Radio 3 history, I mean, it's got a pretty good record in innovation and experimentation, even if it's occasionally disenfranchised people like Cyril Scott. You know, it's got people like Peter Maxwell Davies and Julian Anderson on the airwaves. It's got a pretty good record in that field, hasn't it?
Well, it was so interesting that Peter Maxwell Davies identified the Glock era as this completely breakthrough moment.
Which was 1958-59 when he took over.
And, you know, the surprise with which Glock took that role is fantastically interesting to hear about too. I mean, what I'm trying to bring out is that these things wax and wane, and we have to be very precise about why it was in certain times that this was able to happen. The fact was that the BBC music machinery was not responding to international currents in the avant-garde in the period right after the Second World War, and Glock's wonderful role was to be the conduit through which that opening up could happen, and it was marvellously interesting and important. But the same role may not be appropriate at every period.
Well, this is the problem, isn't it? Because Glock's period, from Peter Maxwell Davies' perspective and from many others, looks like a great deal of openness. But if you were in another camp of composition, you would say, well, no, we're completely underrepresented now. Why aren't we part of this? We're part of this culture too. Why are we not getting represented?
That's right.
This is the problem, isn't it?
Absolutely. Commissioning is inevitably highly political. It could not be otherwise. Here's the controller of a huge purse of money to dispense to composers around the world, but perhaps more than many are British. That cannot help but be a very highly political role. And diversity, of course, depends on your perspective, and Julian Anderson may assert that, and from certain points of view that may be sustainable. But of course, there are always those who feel excluded. There are absences, there are gaps. But the inevitability of the fact that there will be gaps and so on, it seems to me points to the only important message here, which is the need for relentless self-criticism and self-consciousness on the part of the commissioning commissars about what's happening to music and where is it going.
Okay, well, Radio 3's responsibility to the new wasn't just about new music or even new approaches to old repertoire like the early music movement. It was also to continue and to explore new ideas and new drama, to commission, to be at the forefront of new drama. Well, Ned Chaillet joined the BBC Radio Drama Department in 1983 as the editor of Radio 3 Plays, and he commissioned a whole host of new drama, including the pre-Italia winning play from Howard Barker, Scenes from an Execution.
Painting the Admiral. The preliminary sketch.
Do you like my face?
Well, that's a bold question.
I like bold questions.
Well, normally they ask it in a different way. They say, is my face difficult to draw? It is difficult to draw.
I've always been painted cravenly.
How do you mean, cravenly?
The real me, not attempted.
What is the real you? Come on. What's the real you?
The Admiral of the Atlantic, the Admiral of the Two Seas, the General of the Home and Distant Waters...
The presumption then was that it was a cultural station and that drama was an important part of British culture and world culture, which we also represented to a larger degree than Radio 4, say. And I think that the idea was to explore in depth what was happening in drama and what had happened in drama. It was the old Reithian ethic, if you like.
What were the sort of names that you were working with and people that you gave their debuts to?
Well, debuts were people like Martin Crimp, for instance, and there were new plays by people like David Mamet, unperformed early play by Arthur Miller, a number of seasons that would introduce new cultures, if you like. A Russian season, this was still Cold War time, basically. And it went from there to, what happened, Ian McIntyre wanted to go on to do the United States after that. But Ian McIntyre then left, and John Drummond came in, and all of that was cancelled. Drummond then went on to do a Japan season, which was extremely exciting, of course, where we introduced modern Japanese writing and classical Japanese writing.
Did Drummond, though, support the drama department as much as McIntyre had?
To a certain extent. He was very close friends with the head of drama, John Tiedemann. He'd come straight from the Edinburgh Festival, and he still had a kind of festival feel, and he was never as strong on dramas as he was on music. I had considerable rows with him over things. Billy Connolly at one point wanted to do Waiting for Godot with Rick Mayall, but John Drummond wouldn't have Rick Mayall on Radio 3, so it was not acceptable. But he did come up with things like the Japan season, and before he was replaced, he was about to do an Australian season, which would have been pretty interesting, I think.
The story then of where drama sits in terms of what Radio 3 is and Radio 3's identity, I mean, what's the story, do you think, over the last sort of 25 years then of where drama is in Radio 3 and how important, whether you think it's doing the job it should?
Drama's always been one of the most expensive parts of broadcasting, not necessarily on Radio 3 where there are orchestras to maintain and the proms and everything, but it's still an expensive part of speech. The support, I think, for it has been sustained, and Radio 3's output now, with The Wire and its more experimental strand, and with the occasional between the ears doing dramatico works, and the Sunday play, which is usually a 90-minute major work by new writers as well as established ones. So it's quite, I think it works. It's just that because there's not as much variety in the end. You still have to have a classic, a new play, to keep the kind of blend. And you used to be able to balance that across 2 big plays a week and the little ones.
Ned Chaillet. Well, in 1987, John Drummond became the first controller of Radio 3, as we think of it today, the first person to be responsible for both the music and the network together. His uncompromising attitude to quality and his efforts to change the sound of the station prepared the way for the world of the early 1990s. But in 1992, there was a completely new challenge ahead. In September that year, the arrival of Classic FM.
Good morning and welcome to Britain's first national commercial radio station. This is Classic FM. I'm Nick Bailey and this is George Frederick Handel.
Nobody knew the effect that Classic FM would have on Radio 3 or its audience. But Nicholas Kenyon, who'd taken over as controller of Radio 3 in February, wanted to be ready. He changed the station hugely in just a matter of months, both to preempt Classic and to make Radio 3 sound more contemporary. Presenter Paul Gambaccini was a symbol of that change later on. He used to work for Radio 1 and had had a show on Classic. He became part of Radio 3 in 1995, presenting Morning Collection.
In Friday's Morning Collection, the sonata premiered by a shouting soloist, the song with a dying vocalist, and the variations by a twinkling composer. We begin with that mischievous writer, Dochnonyi, and his variations on a nursery song.
The minute it was announced that I was to come to Radio 3, there was an outburst of vitriol in the press, which at first I thought was a joke. Now, I have to say, I didn't know what Radio 3 wanted to achieve with this program. It was going to be a new thing. Well, what was this thing going to be? There were enormous misconceptions. The classical music world is the least happy of all musical worlds, and that is because it has the fewest outlets. So everyone is competing for those outlets. Think of how many talented broadcasters on both sides of the microphone are disappointed that they don't get a shot. So in comes this guy, parachuted in from success as they see it, and he's going to take one of our prime slots. And so there was incredible political sniping about that. And, of course, I was perceived as being down market because I liked people to enjoy my programs. We then got into this amazing situation where I became
a topic for the broadsheets morning collection. This week and next, we're playing the complete body of songs by the French composer Duparc. There were only 17. I was about as welcome on Radio 3 as a severe case of strep throat. Our vocalist today is José. But in the end, you run into invented controversy. And I remember, for example, the Daily Telegraph, which had the most false things about me of any paper. They had, above the title, a picture of me with something about Gambaccini, The Great Battle, or something like that. And I just thought to myself, to the vast majority of the readers of this paper, I am a person who's on breakfast television reviewing films. What's the fight about? Anthea Turner? And only turning inside would they find out that, oh, there's something going on at Radio 3. In the end, the reason I say it was an invented controversy is the figures didn't change. There was no great tune-out. There was no flock from Classic FM. But it was just perceived to be controversial because it became the symbol of the controversy raging around and about the future of Radio 3.
Paul Gambaccini, presenter of Morning Collection from 1995 to 1996. With me now is the person who installed Paul Gambaccini in charge of that show, Nicholas Kenyon, who was controller of Radio 3 from 1992 and then controller of the Proms as well from 1995. And Nick, you finished being in charge of Radio 3 in 1998, I think. Now look, that appointment of Paul Gambaccini was controversial at its time. That may have been one of the reasons the show only lasted a year. But in a certain sense, it symbolised the changes that you brought to Radio 3. What were the things that you wanted to do in 1992, and why did you want to do them?
Well, I think that the assumption that Radio 3 embodied the best qualities of an inheritance drawn from the third programme of that great post-war era where radio could be an educative influence in everybody's lives was still very much around when I arrived at the network, but there was a feeling that in delivering that it had become slightly stuck in the past, not in terms of the musical content or the speech content, both of which were absolutely outstanding, but in the way that it related to the public. The public had changed an enormous amount in the preceding 10, 15 years, just in the way people thought culturally and talked culturally. And so I suppose what we tried to do in those first years at Radio 3 was absolutely to keep the high quality and the high level of the performance, the range of repertoire, the commitment to new music, but to talk about it in a slightly more user-friendly way.
It must have been pretty daunting for you in 1992 in a way, partly because of your non-radiophonic background at that time, and also because immediately you were going to be faced, you knew, with the challenge of Classic FM that was going to be starting broadcast in September 1992.
Why do you think they gave me the job? Nobody else would have wanted it under those circumstances.
But it did mean that when you came in, I think in February, I mean, already in the first few months, you'd instituted major changes, not least changing the presentation style and getting rid of a few of the old school presenters like Tony Scotland and Peter Barker. I mean, there were things which you were doing, you had to do in a very quick space of time to symbolise what you were going to do.
I think looking back on it, one should have moved more gradually, but that wasn't an option at that point. Okay, I fully agree, looking back on it, that we did not give those changes time enough to bed in, and that one, in different circumstances, one would have done them in a very different way. I still think they were the right things to try to do.
What about the changes in presentation? I mean, Brian Kay, Paul Gambaccini, but of course it wasn't just those two. It was Andrew McGregor, it was Penny Gore, it was all sorts of people. Now, in terms of what that means in personnel, well, that's one thing, but it's more interested in what you think the change of tone was and why you wanted to change the tone.
The first thing was to give those who talked on the air a real sense of ownership of the material that they were presenting. Let's remember what actually happened in the period before I was there, which I remember well because I was involved in this as a freelance and as a part-time writer of Radio 3 scripts.
Well, I'm presenting it.
People made programmes. These programmes then had scripts written for them by people in a different building who had no knowledge of why the programme had been made, and those scripts were then taken over to another building and read by a third set of people who were still more removed from the original making of the programme. And so there was a whole process to go through where people like Andrew McGregor, Penny Gore, some of them had already been in the presentation world, but were given more ownership of the material. And I seem to remember the principle that we put forward was that everybody who talked on the air should talk from a position of knowledge and enthusiasm. That was the bottom line.
A very good morning to you. It's 7 o'clock on Thursday, the 4th of October. You're listening to BBC Radio 3.
Variety is the buzzword today. I have a magnificent... Welcome from me, Penny Gore, to Afternoon on 3.
Sunshine all the way to 7 o'clock.
Performance
on 3 this evening is...
Tonight on Nightwaves.
Welcome to the village.
DJs, Doormen and Dealers by Geoffrey Caffrey.
This is BBC Radio 3 this Saturday evening. It's a little after 6:30. And time now for Opera on 3 from Glyndebourne. It's presented by Martin Handley.
Hello.
I can hear the clock inside.
It was recorded in the largest Gothic cathedral in Northern Europe, York Minster. The place is this.
The sounds of today's Radio 3 in 2007. Well, with me now is the man who's responsible for the way that Radio 3 has sounded since 1998, Roger Wright, who's controller of Radio 3 and this year director of the BBC Proms. Roger, one of the things that's come out of this programme, really everyone we've talked to who's been in a position of power or controlling the network in one shape or form, it seems really that you're being pulled in two directions, because on one hand every controller wants to do things that are going to increase the accessibility of the network, and on the other you've got to remain true to the serious-minded values of whatever it is that Radio 3 represents. So, I mean, it must feel sometimes that you've got two, huge opposing forces pulling you apart somehow. I mean, how do you deal with that?
I suppose I don't see them necessarily as opposing forces, because you can still keep the heritage of the station, and there's nobody who works on Radio 3 who isn't aware of that heritage almost on a daily basis. So, in the end, you keep the heritage, but actually what you do is try to make it right for the context of today and the context in which we're now working. And of course you want it to be accessible, but that isn't anything more than, what we often talk about, which is actually sharing our passions. If you believe in something, you want to share it with as many people as possible.
Well, in common with your predecessors, John Drummond and Nicholas Kenyon, when you came in November 1998, you moved quite quickly to do things that would change the network, introduce new programmes. I'm thinking particularly of Late Junction. But what did you want to do in 1998, going into 1999, to put your stamp on it, or to put a marker to say this is what the network should be for the context of the late 90s?
I suppose if there was one thing, it's a real sense of that our audience is not used to the business of just putting particular musics in particular boxes. And so I suppose the idea of Late Junction came from knowing that there were people who were comfortable putting this music next to other sorts of music. And that wouldn't matter whether it was Hildegard von Bingen, or whether it was Jan Garbarek, or whether it was Handel, or whether it was Pat Metheny, and those tastes overlap. Of course, the great misunderstanding was that somehow that was what Radio 3 had turned into overall. And of course, the bulk of Radio 3 has remained and will remain as having Western classical music absolutely at its heart and central to its proposition.
Again, another feature of the 40-year history of Radio 3 is the way that, in a certain sense, that the audience has remained the same. Whatever things people have tried to do, whether it's Paul Gambaccini in 1995 or whether it's Late Junction, in terms of who the audience is, in terms of numerically, it stays the same or, in fact, goes down. I mean, the radar figures, such as we have them since 1999, were 2.28 million, and now they're 1.78 million. I mean, that's a drop of 500,000 listeners. But is it the same constituency that you're appealing to, and does that drop matter to you?
Well, of course, it always matters who's listening to your station. But we keep on saying, simply because it's true, and my predecessors were the same, that in the end, our sole purpose is not to get as many listeners as possible. Because as soon as that becomes a sole purpose, of course, the station changes beyond recognition. We know how to get more listeners. What's very interesting about those particular sort of lobby groups, if you like, is that...
Well, which lobby groups are you thinking of?
Well, the lobby groups who may say, we don't think you should be doing this, we don't think you should be doing that, we'd like more of this, we'd like more of that. Of course, they often change their tune if you start throwing the numbers game back at them. I mean, if they say, look, in the most recent radar figures was a drop of this. Now, I could say, well, let's take a real look at those radar figures, and therefore what we'll take out of our programming is X, Y, and Z. And then the response comes back, oh, no, I think you should take out this. I said, well, actually, if you want the audience figures to go up, if that's the measure, then this is what we need to do. I mean, we'd never broadcast any second Viennese school music, frankly, if we were simply looking at an audience response. So those priorities actually haven't changed, really, since Radio 3 started, since the third programme started.
One of those things is to do with presentation and the way that presentation has changed over the years. I mean, Robert Ponsonby was saying how much it's changed and what he thinks about it today. Not completely complimentary. Other people are great fans of the way the network sounds today as to how it used to sound. What of those changes in presentation in tone supposed to communicate to an audience, and how are they communicating differently to an audience now than they were in 1998?
Well, I mean, I think there's, if you go back over the 40 years, I mean, just the fact that we have presenters rather than announcers is a really significant shift. I think that the tone of the presenter is about actually simply trying to sound more natural. Not more matey, not more chat, but actually simply more natural. That's a very important thing. As is this thing in which authority underpins all of that sort of natural conversation. So I also think, we have professional broadcasters now, and that's not in any way to sort of decry earlier years, but that notion of professional skills of sounding natural whilst at the same time being able to sort of put across particularly complex pieces, but in a more natural and easygoing way.
Where do you see your Radio 3 in terms of the 40-year history of the network, and what's the vision for the future?
I suppose that the vision that I have is the notion that the things that we regard as important of Radio 3 are things that audiences should regard as important. And I'd like to get rid of the notion of classical music as an elite form, for example. And unfortunately, you read on our message boards some people who will express a particular interest and say they've suddenly discovered a particular composer. Recently I saw somebody talking about Scriabin. They've just discovered it. A whole host of other people leap in and say, I can't imagine that you've just discovered Scriabin. Where have you been all this time? That's the sort of elitism based around something which is actually rather unpleasant. What we want to do is to be open and actually share these things, and the vision is to keep the things that we hold important absolutely there, and in a world in which tastes are getting narrower and also concentration spans are getting shorter, that we hold to the notion that these things are the most important things, and this canon of work is vital to our lives.
Roger Wright, controller of Radio 3 and director of the BBC Proms. Well, cultural anthropologist Georgina Bourne is still with me here. Georgina, that concludes the testimony about where we are in Radio 3 today, 40 years on, in 2007. Is Roger Wright right to say that the priorities of Radio 3 haven't changed since the beginning of the third programme 60 years ago, or since the beginning of Radio 3 40 years ago?
In a sense, he gave a very eloquent defence of that position, and of course my heart goes with it and I'm very taken by it. But I have to insist that we're in completely new waters right now. And I think, in a funny way, that perhaps it's not Roger's role to say this, but the fact is there is a huge crisis looming. That crisis consists of, if you like, the death of the classical music industry, the fact that the demographic listening to classical music is ageing and of a certain class profile, and so on and so forth, ethnic profile. In other words, it seems to me that you just soon will not be able to argue that you can follow an audience, nor necessarily should you follow an audience, because you're developing a radio network which should in fact be about leading and giving the public access to new areas of culture, music, arts, the ideas and so on.
I suppose in a certain sense what Roger was saying is that in an age where everything is becoming narrow in a way, the duty, by holding on to those things, by keeping the priorities the same as they have always been at Radio 3, if you like, those things are becoming new for people because there's nowhere else that we can turn in culture generally to find them.
But Tom, a canon is a canon. And for many people, a canon is a very narrow thing indeed. And I'm not at all in disagreement with him when he says that out there, in, for example, the popular music corporate world, things are certainly narrowing. But my goodness, are there huge areas of musical activity, which he bravely put on the air 10 years ago in Late Junction, and some of these zones or strands devoted to the new and unpredictable and the things that could be brought together and juxtaposed in tremendously interesting musical ways. But they've remained zones in the larger schedule, which is still dominated by the rather patrimonial, canonic kind of view. So one of the things, and I'm sure he'll just say I'm another of those lobby voices, but it seems to me that he began a little revolution, and with this huge demographic crisis looming, there'd be a lot to be said for following that revolution through, because the point about Radio 3 is its commitment to the new, to experimentation and invention. That means you have to be even better at outreach, at finding out what's out there. You have to have those teams of producers and people who act like the A&R people in the record companies. And we have to get with it now, because the younger generations are listening in new ways.
Georgina Bourne, thank you very much. So the challenge for the future, then, is how Radio 3 continues to be new and experimental, but continues to represent the canon in some way, and how it relates to its audience, whoever they are.
Music Matters was presented by Tom Service and produced by Jeremy Evans, and it'll be back next Saturday examining the legacy of the composer Luigi Nono, marking the 75th birthday of the London Philharmonic Orchestra, and talking to their principal conductor, Vladimir Yurovsky. Radio 3's 40th anniversary programmes continue in The Breakfast Show tomorrow morning, when Sarah Moore-Peach will be here playing two legendary BBC recordings from the past 40 years. Well, good afternoon to you from me, Ian Skelly. Welcome to Radio 3 today. If you've recently tuned this way, stay with us to explore the music of the French Revolution in a couple of minutes in the first of two editions of this weekend's Early Music Show.